More on the Lotte Group and the THAAD deployment. We are joined in Beijing. Mr. Yang Xiyu, Senior Fellow at the China Institute of International Studies. In Orange County, the United States, we have a professor from South Korea, Professor Oh In-yu, professor at Korea University. In Southampton, the UK, we are joined by Mr. Mike Bastin, a professor at the University of Southampton. Professor Bastin has been a professor in the business responsibility, social responsibility area. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for joining me. I have to go to you, Professor Oh, at the very beginning. What do you make of the business culture in South Korea, in which this time we have seen reflection of that in the investigation of scandals related to President Park and certainly Samsung, some of the other conglomerates as well?
Well, the central theme of this family business in South Korea, or the Jaebol families with a lot of wealth, is defending their property rights in the middle of political turmoil, starting from the Japanese occupation back in the 1930s and 40s, and also the Korean War in the 1950s. So typically the military regimes back in the 1960s and 70s and 80s made Jaebol vulnerable to their defense of property rights in the country. So I think in the family itself, there's a strong cultural backlash here, saying that we have to do whatever we can, on our best terms with the government to neutralize government hostility and therefore maintain our wealth.
Mr. Yang, your judgment here, is Samsung and some of the other conglomerates now suspicious of so-called wrongdoings?
Yep.
Are they the victims, or actually they are the one who mistakens the system?
I prefer go to the second you mentioned. Let's say the other way. Besides President Park, we have seen quite several presidents, former presidents, who fall in the legal troubles, even criminal activities. Why is the reason? Not the individual reason, because the structural problem in the relationship between the politics and commercial circles, say neither clean nor transparent. And they are making a relationship as a mutual uses, mutual benefited. So that is the root for the series of scandals, including the latest one.
Professor Oh, the scandals, as we mentioned, did not sit well with former UN Secretary General, as you may know, Mr. Ban Ki-moon, who retired from the UN position, was thinking about running, but he eventually gave up running for the presidency because what he called deep disappointment over the South Korean political situation. In a news conference, he said this.
My pure patriotism and aspiration are lost by slander and false news reports. Also, I was considerably disappointed at the obsolete, narrow-minded, and selfish demeanor of some lawmakers, which led me to make a judgment that there is no point in walking the path with them.
Professor Oh, the question is, the realities are already there, but the thing is, can the system be improved? What about the other conglomerates that are now under investigation? For example, Lotte, for example, CJ. At this point, they are all being accused, at least by investigators, of wrongdoings.
Well, it has been improved over the years because of democratization. So at the end of the military rule and what I call mafia state rule in 1987, the Jaebol became much more independent from the government hostility, policy hostility, and probably in the name of attacking on their property rights, as I kept saying. So the situation has improved. What Mr. Ban was not happy with Korean people over there was because they were not as international as he thought they would be. But equally, Koreans were dissatisfied with Ban Ki-moon at the same time because he didn't have enough knowledge of Korean politics either.
Right. Well, there are different kinds of accusations going on, of course, at this very chaotic time against organizations, businesses, and individuals as well. Professor Oh, you know better than I do. But at this point, Professor Bastin, when it comes to business operation, how vulnerable business are under the, as we all know, the political environment? And secondly, how can businesses be able to graduate themselves from at least the chaotic situation if they have a way? What likely to be this way? At this point, Professor Bastian, you all know this, that CJ, another conglomerate of South Korea, was being accused by some for producing movies, seem to praising the previous administration of President Park's father, even though that was quite a controversial period of history for South Korea. And also the conglomerate Lotte at this point was on the verge of doing a land swap with government for a deal to deploy THAAD system, which is absolutely controversy when it comes to strategic issues and security issues in the region. So people are asking Professor Bastian, how vulnerable these businesses are and what are so-called right decisions these businesses have to make now at such a critical time?
Well, clearly they're extremely vulnerable. There's a very, very a big lack of separation between the government system in South Korea and the business system. So the chaebol are intricately linked with government and have been really since the 1980s, where many of the leaders are actually voted into the National Assembly and become part of government. So it shouldn't come as a surprise to many that we suddenly see this corruption on this scale. These companies really do have a problem. If they're going to go global, and they have to go global to really succeed these days, then they need to somehow break free of this system. So what do we do? I think we've got to look to some of the countries around the world where corruption is less rife. Transparency International produce a corruption perception index, which is widely credited as being fairly independent nationally. And we see countries like Denmark, Sweden, Switzerland, Finland near the top. South Korea coming at number 52, Somalia at the bottom, 176. And I think it's an influx of people, experienced people from those countries where there is least corruption around the world that is needed in South Korea. I really don't see that South Korea can fix this problem on their own. I think they need an influx from less corrupt cultures. I think this is endemic and it needs to be cleaned out from these typically Scandinavian countries where the values are different and corruption is not a big part of their everyday life.
Well, Mr. Yang, as we see, the Samsung scandal is already so well known, under investigation for quite a long time.
Yep.
But the others, for example, with the Lotte, is popping up at this point.
Yep.
Lotte was having board meetings at the very beginning of this year, trying to come up with a plan what to do with the government if the government really have to swap the land with us. And interestingly, they came out with a report suggesting business-wise, at least for the land swap deal is good for them because they can earn a lot of money.
Yep.
But Mr. Yang, the other thing a lot of multinational companies such as Lotte have to consider is what about worldwide, its impact on the businesses itself. What do you make of this kind of pressure and choice such as Lotte have to make at this point?
Well,
his market is in China, his market is in Russia.
Oh, yes.
His market is in some of the other countries who are having problems with, for example, the THAAD deployment.
Yeah, actually, they are in the two kinds of pressures. They like a sandwich. On one hand, the government has make huge pressures on Lotte, the conglomerate, for the deal, because that is the governmental decision. On the other hand, their own commercial interests, not only inside the South Korea, but also China, Russia, and you mentioned. I can imagine if the Lotte make a decision for the deal with the government that will damage China's fundamental national interests, then their interest in China will suffer a lot.
I want Professor Oh to come in here. Before Professor Oh, I ask you the question, let me explore some numbers with you, Professor Oh, just to go with what Mr. Yang earlier mentioned. Some analysts predict Lotte's business in China, for example, would take a hit if the land swap took place. Since entering the Chinese market in 1994, Lotte has opened more than 100 supermarkets and 5 department stores in 24 provinces and municipalities here in China. Meanwhile, duty-free duty-free stores in Seoul earned 70% of their revenue from the Chinese tourists going to South Korea. A recent poll even shows that over 95% of Chinese consumers will boycott Lotte, some say, if the land swap becomes a reality. Professor Oh, this is what multinational companies have to face. Probably they have some political pressure back at home for one reason or the other, but they also have to answer questions coming from the worldwide consumers. Professor Oh, from business culture's perspective, is there a good plan, do you think, Lotte should take?
Well, Lotte has been very rational by postponing their decisions, in January.
That's
and then
right.
Probably they will postpone another decision in February too. Although on the surface they say they will never change the initial agreement with the government. Well, you have to consider two things here. Number one, Lotte is not a Korean company; it's a Japanese origin, and its holding company decision making is all done in Tokyo. So. They are sandwiched not by just Korea versus China, but by these two governments altogether, along with Japan in the middle. So it's a very complicated situation for Lotte, very sad for the company. But on the other hand, the THAAD for Koreans is not against the Chinese interests, but it's against North Korean missiles. So I think there is room for negotiation here between all these governments involved. If we understand the problem correctly, that it is the North Korea that is causing all these problems, not China, not Japan, or nor South Korea. So
Right.
if the picture is clear and if it's well communicated between parties, we have to probably give a chance for Lotte to consider their position as a multinational in South Korea, although they originate from Japan.
Of course, things are always complicated when it comes to all kinds of players, but there are certain decisions companies have to make that would eventually have an impact on their business and for their future. That's what we are talking about here, Professor Bastian. No matter how complicated the business structure is, no matter how complicated the security and the peace situation on the Korean Peninsula, here is the thing that facing a conglomerate. From a business culture's perspective, Professor Bastian, you've been doing research about that for decades. What do you think is the smart choice? Can Lotte be able to make a neutral or at least a decision without worrying being persecuted or finding trouble by the government?
Yes. The short answer is yes, it can. And when it comes to business culture and Lotte, the issue really is, and I think this spreads across a lot, if not most, of the South Korean conglomerates, and that is their business cultures are still relatively conservative. Whilst they've become international, they haven't really recruited internationally, so they don't have a lot of experience of different cultures, even countries on their doorstep, such as China and their political systems, and they haven't recruited people from those cultures. So in terms of business culture, it needs to be far more open, far less conservative, and it needs an influx of senior managers from different nationalities, from different cultures, and that, I suspect, would lead to far better decision making that really would pacify a number of key government stakeholders.
Very interesting point there. Mr. Yang, before we go, we only have less than a minute time. At this point, this is an imminent event, likely or not likely to happen, the land swap. And therefore, the impact on Lotte's business in this part of the world, likely or not likely to happen as a result. Mr. Yang, what do you make of the latest situation?
Well, Lotte's decision will either delay or help the completion of the governmental plan of the South Korea. As you know, they want to speed up the deployment. But Lotte even postpone the decision that will postpone the huge strategic plan made by the United States and South Korea, but affected on Russia and China.
All right. Obviously, a very hard situation for the South Korean conglomerate. but they probably have to think very clearly. This is a scandal issue that we have been following. We hope to have more latest information for our viewers. But for now, I want to thank the three of you gentlemen for joining us. Professor Oh Ying-yu from South Korea, Professor Mike Bastin from the UK, and Mr. Yang Xiyu here in China with us.